But whenever I was preparing to speak at Feast, I don't enjoy speaking. A lot of people say I couldn't do that. That's the nicest way I can put it. I do not enjoy speaking. I really don't like it. My heart's racing, my breath is racing, everything's racing, and it's terrifying, but it's not as terrifying as disobeying God. So I would much rather be terrified doing something God's told me to do than sitting there disobeying God. So I was praying about what to talk about at Feast because we had the hurricane, and my original Feast talk that I already gave, and I didn't think they'd want me to just do that one again. So I was praying, and I was trying really, really hard, which is hard for me, to wait on what God wanted me to talk about. And in the past, as it got closer, now close to me means Feast is in 3 months. So that's close. I need to already know what I'm talking about. So I would go ahead and just write something just to have it, as a backup in case God didn't come through. And that has yet to happen. Usually I start practicing that and going over that, and then God's like, just delete it. And I have to start all over, and I'm just confused. So this time I waited, and finally God gave me a vision. And in the vision, it was a vision of an altar call. And there were people that were coming down to the altar, and as they came down, there were carefully wrapped presents of all shapes and sizes that were at the altar. And some people came to the altar, they prayed, they picked up their gift, they unwrapped it, and you saw everything change as they received an answer to what they prayed for. And there were some people that came to the altar, they prayed, they stood up, and they walked back. And that was all. And there were some people that came to the altar, actually it was the vast majority of the people that came to the altar, that walked to the altar with what looked like thick oven mitts on their hands. And they prayed, and they believed, and they picked up the gift, and they turned it around in their hands, but they couldn't unwrap it because of the mitts they had on their hands. And God showed me that some people come to the altar ready to receive, and they get an answer to what they prayed about. Some people come to the altar with no belief, and they never even look up to see what God did. And some people, most people, come to the altar with their heartfelt prayers, knowing and believing that God is going to come through, but they can't receive because they won't let go of their mitts. And then I looked down at this point in the vision, and I realized that I was one of the ones with mitts on my hands. I was one of the ones who had come to the altar, and I saw other people get answers, and I had none. I left thinking that God had rejected me. I left thinking I didn't pray right. I didn't do something right. I left thinking I didn't know how to speak so God could hear me. Sometimes I left thinking that God didn't care. And I think there's other people here like that tonight, that you've prayed and prayed and prayed, and you've seen other people get answers, but you haven't. Now I want to explain a little bit. If you're like me and you've been through that before, then God has a message for you today. It's time to surrender the mitts. And I want to explain a little bit about what the mitts are. Some of you who've been around for a while have seen, we've done a play here at our church, Heaven's Gates and Hell's Flames. And if you haven't seen it, it's just picture any play, okay? But that's what I'm going to reference. If you've been a part of Heaven's Gates and Hell's Flames, then you know that whenever you're given a role, they're going to give you what you need for the role. For this person, they're going to get a steering wheel and an empty bottle, and they're told just to wear what they normally wear every day. And for this person, they're going to get a shiny white gown and maybe angel wings. And for the role of Satan, you get full costume, full makeup, glow-in-the-dark nails, and a really cool voice changer. And you might be standing over here with your steering wheel and your empty bottle and your boring everyday clothes and thinking, why didn't I get a voice changer? Do they like them better? Why didn't I get the glow-in-the-dark nails? I want the angel wings. But you were given exactly what you need for what you were called to play for the season that you're in. And that's what God gives you. God will give you exactly what you need, and he will give the other person exactly what they need for the season that they were called to and the role they're called to play. So the first thing we have to let go of is thinking that we have any idea what we're going to need for what God's called us to do. We have to let go of and surrender the jealousy of what somebody else may have and that you think you've been neglected. Now, at the end of Heaven's Gates and Hell's Flames, they will go around and Renee, who helps to run things, she will come and collect everything because they don't belong to you and your role is over. You cannot just decide to take home the angel wings to wear to work the next day to let everybody know what an angel you are. You cannot just decide those sheets of mylar that show heaven on stage are really pretty and you're just going to take them home and put them in your living room. They don't belong to you. They never did. Sometimes you're asked to surrender something you have been blessed with in a season because you don't need them anymore. And sometimes God will ask you to surrender something you've been blessed with in a season because he's not trying to be mean. He's trying to either bless it further or replace it with what you're going to need in the next season. In Ephesians 3:20, it says, "Now all glory to God, who is able, through his mighty power at work within us, to accomplish infinitely more than we might ask or think." God's plan for your next season is infinitely more than you can even comprehend. So you cannot just take everything you've got for this season, stamp property of me on it, and say, but I'm going to need this in my next season. You have no idea what you're going to need in your next season. And you can get pretty excited, like whenever a season is ending and a new one's beginning, and you can think, okay, great. I'll just surrender all these things and he'll give me what I need. And then you start thinking about your blessings. I am so blessed with the husband that I have. I'm so blessed with the children that I have, the comfortable house, the reliable car, my church family. You mean surrender means that I need to give up control of those things to God, but they're mine. You gave them to me to manage. Those are mine, and I can do what I need to do. But surrender means that you have to pray for your husband instead of trying to change him all day. Surrender means that you're going to turn your wayward child's salvation over to God instead of preaching to them all day and guilting them into coming to church. Surrender means you're going to turn your child's health over to God instead of focusing all your energy on finding the next supplement that might help. Surrender means turning it over to God and trusting him more than you trust yourself. And you may not believe this, but God will actually do a better job than you. And I know you don't, or you would have already done it. And you have to understand, it helps me to understand whatever the situation is, good or bad, whatever it is, the power that flows through it is going to come from the hands that hold it. How tight do you want your hands holding it? Or would you rather put it in God's hands and let God's power flow through it? Back to the heaven's gates and hell's flames analogy. What if you've got your angel gown, your white gown, and as you pick it up, the glow-in-the-dark nails fall out? And you pick it up all the way, and there's a steering wheel. And you're looking over at everybody else, all the other angels, and thinking, they don't have those, but I do. I was given these, so I've probably got to try to figure out a way to work these into my role. I'm not sure how an angel is going to drive and have some fancy nails, but you're going to spend all your time and energy trying to work these in because they're in your box. You'll be so confused and frustrated and overwhelmed trying to figure out how to make everything you have work into what you think the plan is. And this shows up a lot in our schedules. Satan will throw what looks like a blessing in there just to distract you. Especially, a lot of times this shows up in schedules and opportunities. You say yes to every opportunity that comes across because it sounds good It sounds like it could be good. It looks good from the outside. And these are all things that you need to surrender to God because you don't know what's good and what's bad, what's a distraction, what's leading you the wrong direction, what's occupying all your time so you can't focus on the real task that God's given you. Back whenever I grew up in the 80s, I don't know why this was such a big concern, but I remember at Halloween, they always thought that we were going to have razor blades and needles in our candy. And to the point that I remember hospitals opening up and allowing you to take the candy in and x-ray your child's candy because it all looks like candy from the outside. It all looks edible. It all looks good. You can't tell what's on the inside until you run it through. So whenever you surrender your blessings, all of them, what you think are your blessings, to God, he's going to run it through just like that. And he'll be able to separate out what's bad because you can't tell just by looking. Sorry? Okay. Now, whenever I've done this, whenever I pray to surrender all the blessings, and I go through and I name them, I'm going to say, God, I'm feeling so overwhelmed and so anxious and so frustrated. I know this can't be your plan. So I'll start telling him, God, I'm giving you this on my schedule, this opportunity, this opportunity, this opportunity. And I get very, very specific. And I will pray for God to give me a peace and a joy about what I'm supposed to continue, and that he will shut the door and kill anything I'm not supposed to. Now, that is a dangerous prayer, because just to warn you, jobs will be lost. Friends will move. Friends will stop talking to you. The things that God did not intend to be in your life, although they look like a blessing, are going to go away. But you can rejoice in those because you can know that you're skimming it down. You're slimming it down to exactly what is going to be a blessing to you and to God and his kingdom. And you're not going to be as distracted. Another one, I was listening to someone named Graham Cook. I don't know if anybody's heard Graham Cook, but and he was explaining a dream that he had. He has a lot of dreams. And I may read part of it so I don't mess it up. But he said in his dream, he was sitting in his house and he heard a ruckus outside. And it sounded like an army coming up the driveway. So he went over to the window and he looked out and it was Jesus. So he ran to the door really quickly and he opened up the door and said, Jesus, come on in. And Jesus walked in and he said, give it back. Where's my stuff? And Graham said, what stuff? And Jesus said, you took something that belongs to me. Now give it back. And Graham said, I don't understand, Lord. Everything I have, you gave me. And Jesus said, no, that's not true. You took something that's rightfully mine, and I want it back now. And Graham thought about it, and finally he said, reveal it to me, Lord. I don't know. What is it? And Jesus said, that anger, that bitterness, jealousy, rage, depression, shame, I died for it. I paid the full price for it. It doesn't belong to you. Now give it back. Don't you get it? I took all that from you and killed it on the cross because I don't want you to have it. I paid the price. I have the keys. It belongs to me. Now give it back. Sometimes Satan will mix his special little gifts in there as a description of the role that you're called to play. And it does not match the description that God has given you. You can look in the Bible for your identity, the true story of who God's called you to be. But Satan will do a rewrite in the script. He'll say this role is now played by an anxious person. This role is played by a sickly person. And you just assume these are part of you, that it's not something you can change, and that is how you're called to play the role, that you have to play the role as an anxious person, as a person with illness, any of the other things that Satan puts on you. So when you feel shame, depression, anger, bitterness, you have to recognize those as stolen goods. Jesus bought and paid for those so that you would not have it and Satan is trying to pass stolen goods off on you. And what do you do when you have stolen goods? You turn it into the proper authority. And God is the proper authority. So you can surrender all those things to God. And when you surrender them to God, he's not going to question you. He's not going to judge you. He's not going to punish you. He's going to reward you. There is a great reward for returning those stolen goods. Now, I want us to read in Isaiah 61, 1-7. I think they're maybe pulling that up. As they pull it up, I want you to really think about, I have had a tendency in the past to read, especially through the Old Testament, through the prophecy, and I just see things as these old things that the prophets said to the people, and it's interesting. But I want you to really think about that a lot of times the words of the prophets, God is timeless, and his message is timeless. So as we read through it, I want you to first of all see the heart of God, what his plan is for you. This is a message from Isaiah to God's chosen people, and you are God's chosen people. So I want you to personalize this message for you, and I want you to personalize it for your children and your children's children. And while we're reading through, I want you to also notice there's a lot of times in the Bible that God will repeat himself for emphasis. Typically, it's 3 times. Well, in here, there's a word that shows up 5 times, just to make sure you get it. Maybe. We're going to read through. The Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is on me, because the Lord has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom for the captives and release from darkness for the prisoners, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor and the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all who mourn and provide for those who grieve in Zion, to bestow on them a crown of beauty instead of ashes, the oil of joy instead of mourning, and a garment of praise instead of a spirit of despair. Think about this next part, describing your children and your grandchildren and your great-grandchildren. They will be called oaks of righteousness, a planting of the Lord for the display of his splendor. They will rebuild the ancient ruins and restore the places long devastated. They will renew the cities that have been devastated for generations. Strangers will shepherd your flocks, foreigners will work your fields and vineyards, and you will be called priests of the Lord, and you will be named ministers of our God. You will feed on the wealth of nations, and in their riches you will boast. Instead of your shame, you will receive a double portion, and instead of disgrace, you will rejoice in your inheritance. And so you will inherit a double portion in your land, and everlasting joy will be yours. That's pretty exciting just to read like that. Thinking of that directed at you and your family and your future generations. But I don't know if anybody noticed that didn't go to feast. What word was repeated 5 times? It was instead. God is a God of insteads. He'll give you a crown of beauty. Now that in those days was what they put on for a wedding celebration. So he'll give you a new family, a new season, a new life, a new beginning, if you surrender the ashes of your old life. He'll give you joy if you surrender the mourning. He'll give you praise if you surrender the despair. And he knows how much shame and disgrace have weighed you down. Because when you bravely surrender shame and disgrace, you get a double portion, an everlasting joy. God does not just dilute the bad with the good. He exchanges it. When you'll let go of the bad, then you'll get the good. And this is proven even in science. I love reading everything. But but I was reading this article, and they were talking about a study that neuroscientists had done. And I just thought it was fascinating because they were talking about that in the human brain, there's chemicals that are released whenever we do different activities and we feel different emotions. There's different chemicals that they can measure that are in the brain. And whenever you are having anxiety or despair, so it would say in there, when you're despairing, there's a chemical that's released. Whenever you are showing gratitude, specifically, there's a chemical that's released. And they discovered in this study that the two chemicals cannot be released at the same time. So it's one or the other. You can flip from anxiety to gratitude, and your brain flips. Well, they discovered whenever somebody shows one act of gratitude, just one, or praise, as it says in Isaiah, one act, when they measured the chemicals, the levels of happiness, that chemical, went up 10%. Depression went down 35% with one act of praise or gratitude. Well, then they followed in this study, and they found that people that chose, because it's a choice which path you're going to choose, people that chose gratitude repeatedly, it had the same effect on the brain as taking an antidepressant. Scientists, even unbelieving scientists, are proving God's word, and they don't even know it, that God is a God of insteads. He'll give you thankfulness instead of anxiety. Now back to the original vision. I said that I had mitts on my hands, and I'm not going to go over my whole story. Some of you have heard more than you want, and this isn't the time to go over all of it, but suffice it to say, my childhood was not stable in any way, shape, or form. I never knew if I was going to walk into the kitchen and find my mother happily cooking dinner, or if I was going to find her passed out drunk and I thought she was dead. My life was not stable, but I learned that I could prepare by controlling every detail possible. And then I could be prepared for every possible outcome. And I could create a fake peace in my life. Because if I was prepared for it, things could be more peaceful. So this became myths in my life, that I needed to control absolutely every aspect of my life so that I would always know every possible outcome. And I brought that into adulthood. And I brought that into raising my kids. I homeschooled my kids because I didn't trust anybody else's input. I needed to control every single aspect of their life so that I would be prepared for anything that came up. I know best. I made my own baby food because I didn't trust the companies that made it. I know best. I usually did home remedies instead of going to the doctor because I don't trust any of them. I know best. Now, I would not necessarily change any of those choices now. I don't think any of those are bad choices, but my reasonings for doing them were not healthy. They were not good. I was doing them to be controlling so that I could create a fake peace in my life. I was trying to control the circumstances to create peace instead of having true peace despite the circumstances. So when I realized that, I had to come to the realization that I trusted myself more than I trusted God in those situations. And that's hard to recognize. So when I recognized it, I acknowledged it, I repented for it, and I knew I needed to surrender those myths. So here's what it looked like for me. I held up my hands and I said, okay, God, take them. Yeah, nothing happened. Because God is waiting. He's waiting for you to slide them off. He's waiting for you to offer them up. And the hardest part, he's waiting for you to let go of them. And for the first time in decades, I saw my bare, cold hands, and I had no idea what to do with these. I know what to do with the mitts on. I know what to do when I control every situation, but I don't know what to do when I'm not in control. Just to warn you, God is not going to make you feel comfy and cozy in this next new season. He's waiting to see what you're going to do. So just as I suspected, things started happening. I let my kid try something new without me controlling every detail. And look, they got hurt. I stood my ground a little bit, and they got mad at me. I opened up to somebody a little bit and they shut me out. I was feeling the cold on my hands for the first time. I was feeling the bruises and the scratches on my hands for the first time. And I started having these thoughts. I'm feeling so vulnerable and broken right now, worse than I was before. So did God really want me to surrender those mitts? Or was that all my idea? I bet you that was my idea, because all that's happened now is I've become more vulnerable to the attacks of the enemy. Who would want me more vulnerable? Satan would. I bet Satan tricked me into taking off those mitts because those mitts were helping me. Those mitts kept me safe. God wouldn't want me to not be safe. God wouldn't want me to not be helped. And that's exactly how Satan has worked since the beginning of time. Since the Garden of Eden, he said, did God really want you? Did God really say? He just whispers doubts. So I look over at this point and I see my mitts are still sitting there. He didn't even take them. And this situation's coming up. I'm just going to go put them back on. So I go and I put them, this is being honest, I put them back on, I handle this situation, and then I take them off and put them back. And then something else would pop up, and I would give God, at least 5-10 minutes. Are you going to handle that? Are you going to handle that, or should I? You're busy. So I'll just go over here and I'll put them back on again. Go over here, handle it the only way I know how, the only way I've ever done for my entire life. And then I'm like, I don't think I'm supposed to have those, so I'll just put them back now. And I did this for probably years, and I thought I was surrendering. And then I realized I've got to make a major change. This is not helping anything. This is just keeping me frustrated. So here's the point that I had to come to. I had to tell myself, when I walked over and I decided I was going to pick up those mitts, I was going to have to make myself actually say out loud, God, I made a mistake giving these to you. I can handle it better, and put them back on. And nobody wants to say that out loud to God. Even if you think it, you don't want to say it. So the other option is to follow the example of Elisha in the Bible. And I'm not going to read the whole thing. If you want to go read the story, it's a great story in 1 Kings 19. Well, Elijah was a prophet, and God had told him that it was time to anoint the next prophet, who was going to be Elisha. I don't know why the names have to be so similar and confusing, but I didn't plan it. So Elisha, try to enunciate. Elisha was a farmer, or at least he was farming that day. And he's out there and he's got his plow and his oxen, and he's just preparing for his new season. He's taking care of what he's got to take care of and preparing for his new season. Elijah was walking past him. God said, that's the one. So he takes off his coat and he throws it on Elisha's shoulders and he just walks off. Didn't he say anything? Somehow, Elisha in that moment knew what that meant, that he was now being anointed and called to be the next prophet. I don't know how he knew that. But so Elisha, the newly anointed prophet, he had a choice to make. He knew he was about to step into a new calling, step into a new season, and he didn't want the midst of his former season to be a stumbling block. So he actually took his plow, which he needs for farming, tore it apart and set it on fire. And then he took his oxen, which he needs for farming, and cooked them on the fire. So you can choose, just like Elisha, to finally set fire to the midst in a burnt offering to God. And when you set fire to something, it's no longer usable. It's no longer an option. It is not something you can even think of choosing again. So you can keep going back and forth year after year after year after year, or you can finally say, I'm done with this. I'm not going to leave this as an option anymore. and you can set fire to your mitts. When you do that, you've completely surrendered. And now your hands are finally free to open up the gift that God has had sitting there since the first time you prayed for it, just waiting for you to be ready to receive it. And maybe right now, some of you might already know some things that you need to surrender. God might already be whispering some things to you. If he's not, then pray for God to search your heart and to reveal your fears. Because a fear is nothing but a marker of an area you don't trust God enough in. And that's an area that you need to surrender. We're going to open up the altars, just like we did at Feast, just open up an opportunity for you to come, just like in the vision. And you may have come here today, just like the first people in the vision, fully surrendered and ready to receive. The gifts are here ready for you. You may have come like the people who didn't have belief, but God's not afraid of those. Bring your doubts to the altar and talk about them with God. And I challenge you to wait and look for what God's done. Don't just pray and leave, but sit in his presence long enough to receive, long enough for him to show you and talk to you. Or you may have come, like most of the people here probably, with mitts on your hands that it's time to surrender. You may need to surrender your blessings so that you can walk into a new season and let God's power flow through them, let him return them to you better than they were before, or let him replace it with what you're going to need in the next season. You may need to surrender your overwhelming blessings so that God can sort them out and let you know what you need to hold on to and what you need to let go of. You may need to surrender stolen goods, surrender the anxiety, surrender the sickness, surrender guilt, surrender shame, surrender everything the enemy has tried to call you that God did not. Surrender those things so that you can receive what God has for you instead. You've been in a battle. You've pleaded, and God has already answered. If you're desperate enough to surrender, then the altars are open for anybody that wants prayer. I'm sure some of the leaders will come. If anybody wants prayer over the things that they're surrendering.
You've been listening to Destiny City Church, a community of believers committed to helping others find and fulfill their God-given destiny. For more information, visit us online at destinycity.org.